Welcome back, Honestman, Witcher 3, first playthrough. This episode is going to be something of an intermission between the main story and the DLC, and I'm going to focus on the skill tree. So, no story here whatsoever, we're just going to talk game mechanics. So, that should tell you right up front whether or not this is something that you're interested in. But without further ado, let's jump into it. The good news, bad news is that if you're leveling up and you make a mistake, you can purchase a potion of clearance, to refund all of your ability points. That's the good news. The bad news is it costs 1,000 gold, which isn't chump change, but it is an option nevertheless. So we're going to pop this guy. Now, clean slate here. Let's start with the general branch. I think this is the simplest one. And there's a lot of interesting stuff in here depending upon what you're going for, sort of your concept. Like if you want to lean heavy into the crossbow, or you want to lean heavy into bombs or signs, there's a lot of interesting choices. But everything that I'm going to be talking about here is obviously going to be in reference to sort of my play style. And as such, it's going to be very combat focused. And for a combat-focused build, I don't think there's much here. Really, you just want to get into one of these Witcher school techniques. And for me, it's cat school. You're just cat school. Because you gain fast attack damage and critical hit damage using cat school and wearing light armor. Griffin School, this is if you're going sign oriented. Obviously, that's the direction you'd want to go. Bear School, I can see an argument for Bear School, but I don't think it's a good argument. Because I would argue that offense is better than defense, and I'd much rather have more critical hit damage than more vitality. And similarly, I feel like light attacks are much better than strong attacks, frankly. And it's because they're faster. So, I mean, obviously some of that speed disadvantage can be mitigated as you're chaining things together, certainly, but your bread and butter, your opening strikes, and perhaps even your finishing strikes, are always going to be fast attacks. So if I'm choosing between fast and strong, I'm going to pick fast. I'm going to prioritize fast. So I think all of that favors cat school. Now, I guess another caveat here is that my play experience to this point has been the normal difficulty level. Perhaps this calculus changes at the top ends of the difficulty spectrum. And maybe there becomes a case for Bear School. But I would be very surprised, and for reasons that hopefully will become apparent as I work through the rest of the tree, I would be very surprised if you really need to go deep into defense. The only other thing I'm going to call out on general here is in the very early going, I thought Sun and Stars was good. It's not. It's awful. The problem is just the regeneration effect is way too weak and it doesn't work in combat. So, okay, well, it's out of combat healing, right? Is basically what it boils down to then. But there's a million sources of out-of-combat healing. You can meditate anytime you want. Food sources are abundant. So this is really a waste of a point as far as I'm concerned. And I guess to be clear too, right, like the points on the left here are not really the important part. Our bottleneck is always going to be the number of abilities we can slot on the right-hand side. So we have to get down to 12 here. So there's no way, even at one point, there's no way Sun and Stars is good enough in my view. But speaking of the right-hand ability slots, I am under the impression that the DLC will change this up a little and perhaps give us some additional slots, which is all the more reason I wanted to have this conversation now before it changed, targeting people just going through the main game the way I did, right? This is how I approached it. These are maybe some thoughts to consider. But that is going to do it for the general branch. We got our cat school, and we are done. Signs, this should be pretty easy to knock out as well. Delusion, I love delusion. We're going to plug that up here. I really like delusion because it gives you dialogue options. It lets you affect the story in certain ways, not in like major arc ways, but in smaller ways, which I think is fun. Which is to say, this is more role-playing oriented than a lot of the other abilities that I'm going to talk about. Now, the way that manifests a lot of times, or at least sometimes, is it'll let you bypass a fetch quest, or it'll let you bypass a combat, or these sorts of things. And I can see the counterpoint to that, which might be something akin to, the whole reason we're here is to play a game. Why would I invest in an ability that skips the game, right? That skips this side quest, skips this fetch quest. And I can respect that. But for me, I think it's fun. I like having it in my pocket. I like being able to persuade people. So your mileage may vary. The other thing I'll note about Axie is that it's free XP. It's free, non-diminishing XP every time you use it, which isn't huge, but it adds up, and it's just rewarding to get that chunk for that successful persuasion. Now, in combat, pretty situational in combat. I'm really only dipping here because of the role-playing ramifications, but it can be a good stun, especially against humans. And certain other creatures, based on the bestiary, might have a vulnerability here. But it's, for me, like I said, it's primary role-playing. Now, Puppet. I think Puppet is a trap. Hear me out, because I know a lot of people are high on this. And it is extremely powerful. Don't get me wrong, this is very powerful. The problem, and there are multiple problems, the problem is that it's too slow. Right? The amount of time it takes you to puppet someone is way too long, right? Because you need a good 2.5 to 3 seconds, it feels like, to get it off. And during that time, you are completely exposed and stationary. So in the precise situations where you would want to puppet someone, which is to say, I'm outnumbered, let me turn someone and help even the odds and swing the complexion of this combat. In those precise situations, puppet is least likely to work, because while you are trying to puppet someone, one of those other 3 or 4 guys is going to smack you in the face and knock you out of it. I have failed at puppeting far more than I have succeeded. So, in short, this is a trap. I don't like it. Now, again, back to the difficulty level. I think on the top difficulty levels, I can understand why someone would maybe invest here and then really try to engineer around it, right? Because it is so strong, being able to turn someone and have them basically wipe out the enemy force is pretty crazy. So I can understand why someone would do it there and really, really try to make it work. But I really question how successful you would be then. Even that, even trying to double down as this being a centerpiece of your strategy, I have a hard time imagining what that would look like in practical terms when you would actually need it, right? Because if it's a one-on-one situation, puppeting someone is trivial, but I feel like that's not when you need it. You need it when you've got a swarm of enemies coming at you. So, and then similar for, domination, trying to get 2 people. And maybe that makes it easier, right? If you can try to stun 2 of them coming in and puppet them, increases the likelihood that you're going to successfully puppet. But that's just way too deep. That's way too much of an investment for my liking. So in short, I think Puppet's a trap. I don't like it, especially at normal difficulty. I don't recommend it. Yurden and Ard. I think these 2 signs are in the same boat in that they're both good enough, right? When I need to slow something down with Yurden, do I wish it lasted longer? Sure. But it's long enough for what I need. Similar with Ard. Like if I'm against a flying enemy and I need to knock them down with Ard, it gets the job done. Would I like a longer range? Sure. But it's fine as is. The default is fine. So I really don't see a case for pushing deeper into either of these. And like, yeah, I wish Ard did some damage. That would be cool. But that's not good enough. For how situational this is, that's not good enough. Ard sweep, to strike in a radius instead of like a forward wave. That's kind of cool. But that's not good enough. And like furthermore, I'm going to talk more about this in the combat branch. If you need something that hits in all directions, you're making some really bad choices, right? And if anything, this is sort of suicidal because I feel like it's going to tempt you into walking into the middle of a pack with the idea that you're going to hard sweep. I don't think that's going to work out too well in a lot of cases. So all of this is to say, I like Ard, I like Yurden, but I like them just fine at their standard level. I don't think you need further investment. Igni is interesting. I think that Melt Armor in particular piqued my interest. Weakens enemy armor. So there's a couple problems with this though. The first is, from my understanding, humanoid enemies basically don't have any armor. Right? The graphics be damned. As far as gameplay is concerned, their armor scores are quite low, and therefore the effects of melt armor are going to be negligible. Enemies that tend to have higher armor rankings are monsters, but at that point you've already marginalized your usefulness of melt armor, right? You've right away gotten into situational territory of, well, I'd have to be fighting something very particular for this to be valuable, as opposed to investing into something that's going to give you value regardless, right? Because again, we need to get down to 12 abilities over here. And to invest into something that's super situational, it better be really, really good at that situation. And I just don't feel like melt armor qualifies. So that leaves us with Quen. I think for a combat build, Quen is the best sign there is. Have that shield up. And do we want that pushback when it breaks? Absolutely. Love that. And then active shield. This is amazing, right? Especially since you can go into active shield and then manually disengage it and create the exploding shield. That's just so good. So we're going to max these out. And active shield is why I think things like vitality and heavy armor, I have a really hard time seeing the case for them, right? When you can just go active shield and get your vitality back by absorbing damage, that's crazy, right? You're basically invincible. It's an invincible heal. So, that's been, I'm not going to say my bread and butter, because that'd be an overstatement, but that's just so strong an effect, and you can lean on that however much or however little you need. And I just think that's a great value, even though, and I'll probably mention this more in a bit, I would rather not invest into something that's just pure defense. But I think the value proposition on this is too good, and also the fact that it's kind of offensive, right? Depending on how you use it. Like if you're manually dropping it to create the exploding shield and get that pushback, it sort of becomes an offensive ability, honestly. So definitely be aware of that. That's a tactic you can use to great effect, I think. But that is going to do it for signs. Now let's get into our bread and butter here, combat. So as I mentioned earlier, fast attack, it's all about fast attack. So we want more fast attack damage. We want more crit chance. Yes, please. All about the crit chance. And even though I prioritize fast over strong, we definitely do want strong attacks as well. So these first two ranks, Strength training, crushing blows, we want those, as well as for fast. There we go. And we'll slot these in up here. So these are all passive, and just more damage, more crit chance. We're all about that. That's what we want. Now, and then we get down to Rend and Whirl. So I've got a lot of problems here. Like I mentioned with Ard, I think Whirl, hey, it sounds cool on paper, right? Spin around and strike all foes around you. In practical terms, I don't like it. Like, if you're walking into the middle of a pack, I feel like you're making some really bad tactical decisions, and that's probably going to backfire on you pretty quick. So I don't like Whirl. If you're controlling the battlefield at all, you're not going to be surrounded, and if you are surrounded, you're not going to stand there and Whirl. You're going to try to get the hell out of there and re-engage on your terms, divide and conquer. So I mean, I can imagine if you're on like a lower difficulty level, maybe this is pretty fun, but that does not seem like a good idea, a good tactic to me. Now, Rend, let me come back to Rend. Let's talk about some of the rest of the stuff here first. I think Razor Focus is really good. Instantly gain 1 adrenaline point. And the way to think about that is each adrenaline point is 10% damage. So it's sort of basically saying plus 10% damage, which I think is pretty hard to argue with. The counterpoint, I think, would be, well, I'm maxing out my adrenaline anyway, so it's really only a 10% buff at the start of an encounter. And I think that's a legitimate criticism, but not super compelling in my view. And the reason I say that is that I feel like the encounters are just over too quick, right? I mean, I've definitely maxed adrenaline, make no mistake, but I feel like the preponderance of encounters that I'm in, the preponderance of combats, they're over before I get to 3 adrenaline. So this is basically like just a straight up 10% damage buff with no real downside. But I do understand, I do appreciate the fact that any longer combat, you end up stop getting benefit from this at a certain point. But I think the pros outweigh the cons for this for me. So definitely like Razor Focus. And it does have great synergy with Undying if you decide to go for Undying. Now, Resolve I like as well. Let's max it out here. Because here, damage doesn't cause adrenaline loss, just straight up. You're basically immune to damage. Your adrenaline is immune to damage. Now, I would mostly try to avoid defense-only abilities, and I'm going to talk about that more in a second with Undying. But I think Resolve is worth it because the way I think about this is that it's protecting, it's insurance for your damage, basically, right? Because those adrenaline points equal damage bonus. So this prevents you from losing that damage bonus. This preserves your offense. So I don't see this as defensive per se. It sort of straddles between offense and defense and protects your damage bonus. That's the way I think about that. So I definitely do like Resolve. Let's focus here. Undying, on the other hand, I do not like Undying. Now, is it strong? Yes. Yeah, to be Undying, that sounds pretty good. I don't like it because it's playing to lose. The only time you get value from this is when you die. I would much rather invest one of my 12 ability slots here into something that's going to keep me from getting into that situation in the first place, right? Something that's going to enable me to win, not prevent me from losing. So I want to play to win, not play to lose. So that is why I do not like Undying. I'd much rather use that slot on something that's going to help me kill enemies faster, right? Help keep me out of the position where I need Undying in the first place. And we only have 2 more spots to go here. So it's very slim pickings. So where do we go with those points? Obviously, the crossbow branch here is very focused on crossbow. If that's your deal, it's not really my deal. Arrow deflection, God, I like, because arrows are so annoying, especially in the early game. But once you get more adept at dodging and rolling, it's less of an issue. And it's just not super common in the grand scheme of things that you're going to be facing a lot of archers. I know it can feel that way at times, but on the whole, that's a pretty marginal sort of deal. Fleet-footed, this seemed good to me at first. It makes you invincible while dodging. And maybe this is one of those that's clutch on higher difficulty levels. But I seriously can't think of a single time where I was hit while I was dodging. Like, I'm not even sure that's a thing, frankly. Maybe I'm just super good at dodging. I don't know. But I don't think I would get any real value from this. It's too defense oriented. Counterattack, I can see a case for counterattack. Right? After a successful counterattack, the next attack deals more damage. That seems pretty good to me. I don't know if it's good enough, but this one is interesting to me, especially as you get more adept at counterattacking. I think that's on the bubble, but I'm going to go a different direction. And I think the direction I'm going to go is Sunder Armor. Now, I honestly don't know how good this is, frankly. Reduces enemy damage resistance. I don't know how they calculate that. And it's also not clear to me if that's... I think it means specifically when I'm using a strong attack. So not just any attack. Specifically a strong attack is going to reduce DR. I don't know that I've observed that in practice. In my field testing, I'm having a really hard time noticing this effect. So this might be a trap, but compared to all the other traps, I think it's the least egregious one, right? Because on paper, at least, this is the sort of passive I like. It doesn't seem super situational. I feel like this should affect, humanoids and monsters alike. So that seems good to me. Now, that brings us over to Crippling Strikes. So unlike Sunder Armor, which my interpretation, at least, is that this is pretty broadly applicable, Crippling Strikes is far too situational. So it applies a bleeding effect, which sounds great on paper. Here's the problem. Enemies are immune to bleed. There's enemies that are immune to bleed. There are enemies that are immune to poison. So there are certain fights, certain encounters where this literally does nothing. It's literally just adrenaline point gain bonus, but you get that bonus from literally anything in this branch. So that's not really a selling point. So right out the gate, too situational. And even when it does work, I just don't think it's strong enough. Even at level 5, where I think it's 100 or 200, I don't know what the number is, even maxed out, the effect just isn't strong enough, in my view, to warrant investment here. So I don't like Crippling Strikes. I think it's too situational and the effect is too weak. So where do we go with our final slot? I think this is where it's really tough, and I think you could go a lot of different ways here and be in good shape. And as I said before, I think Sunder Armor is kind of on the bubble too. So I think there's a little bit of flexibility if you're going combat focused like I am on where to go with this last slot, but also the one prior. For my money, I'm going to go Rend. Now, the reason I hesitate is because it's too slow, right? Strong attacks are slow. Rend is extra slow because you have to hold down the button. And a lot of times, like if an enemy, like fiends are a good example because they're really big and slow, they don't attack super fast. If it's a big, slow enemy that you can hit with Rend, it's sort of just a win more button, right? Like you shouldn't have any trouble killing those just with multiple fast strikes and staying nimble. You don't need a Rend to really rub it in, but it's fun. It's fun to throw out a big hit especially with the crit chance bonus, and we're already going to be investing our build around crit, which I should mention more of actually. So as soon as you can get yourself some Assassin's Gloves, Assassin's Gauntlets, that's the way to go. Plus 10% crit chance. So, that gives us, with the passives that I've selected here, we're running steady at 30% critical chance, both fast and strong. That feels pretty good. And then, for my cat armor, my light armor, I've got the superior feline gear in the other 3 slots. And then obviously on your sword, you want some crit bonus too. I really wish this Ursine Silver Sword had a higher crit chance. This is only +5. I wish it was +10 like some of the other Witcher weapons. But this has the best critical hit damage bonus of +75%. So I guess in the final analysis, I'd rather have a much bigger damage bonus than a relatively smaller critical hit chance bonus. But such as it is, that's what I'm running with, the Ursine Silver Sword. As I was saying, I've got a 30% critical hit chance, and then Rend here at level 5 is an additional 50%, so that's an 80% crit chance, and I've got a whole lot of crit damage bonus going as well, between my light armor and cat school gear and my sword. So really big hits with Rend, just makes it fun. And it's, you are painting yourself in a corner a little bit because some enemies are just going to be too fast. You're not going to be able to get a Rend off. Don't try. You're going to get killed trying. But, on paper at least, it works for all enemies, monsters and humanoids. And it's just a nice, fun ability to be able to throw out with a big attack. Last but not least is Alchemy. So we used up all our slots, but there's some good stuff in here to shoot for in the future. In the early going, I really thought that Fixative was good because at level 3 Fixative, your blade oils never expire. That's not good. It's awful. And the reason it's awful is because of a couple of reasons. First and foremost, oils. I'll show you my oils. A superior oil has 60 charges. 60 hits. I can count on one hand the number of times 60 hits was not enough. And one of those times was the final sequence, which was a little bit of a marathon. But even if it runs out, even if 60 is not enough, the rare occasion where 60 is not enough, you can just come into this menu and put more on. Right? You can do that mid-combat. So Fixative is really just a convenience more than anything. And it's not even a really big convenience, honestly, because it's not like you're going through, tons of insects and then tons of ogres or what have you. At least the way I play, as I was navigating the quests and going through the game, I was constantly changing the oil. Right? There'd be a vampire that would pop up. There'd be a fiend. I'd be in here all the time changing my oil. So having oil that doesn't expire is not super helpful. It's not even much of a convenience, as I said. So Fixative is bad. I don't like it. Again, there's some highly situational stuff in here. Like if you're big into bombs, obviously, some of these bomb effects are interesting. That's not my jam. If you're big into potions, some of this stuff is interesting. I dabble. I wouldn't say that I'm big into potions. So some of these other ones aren't super interesting. I think for me, for a combat-focused build, Alchemy is really, it starts and ends with synergy. Because level 5 synergy, I believe this is a 50% bonus to your mutagens. So if we look over on the right-hand side here, I have my greater red mutagens here, giving me plus 40% each. This would be synergy would be a 50% bonus, bringing that to 60% each. And similarly, my sign intensity would go from 40% to 60%. That's crazy. For a single ability slot to have that much of an effect, even though in this bottom right tree here is where it would get slotted in, it would decrease the bonus on this end. You more than make up for it with the other three. So I think synergy is crazy good. Obviously, they're counterbalancing that by the fact that you have to invest a grand total of 25 points into alchemy to get level 5 synergy, to get down the branch. But that's the long game, as it were, is figure out how to get 20 points into here to unlock synergy. And then at that point, I would plug synergy in, replacing either Sunder Armor or Rend, whichever I like the least in that moment, I think. I think everything else is pretty much a lock for me. So it would just be one of these two getting the bump. And it's probably Sunder Armor. As I said earlier, I have a hard time noticing this effect during my field testing. I'm not sure I'm getting a ton of value here. So that would probably be the one on the bubble for me that I'd swap in or swap out. The other ones that I will mention in Alchemy, however, are Protective Coating. I think almost certainly this would be one of the ones that I pick up on my way to Synergy. Protective Coating gives you protection against the monster type of your oil. And I'm constantly, like I said, I'm constantly changing that oil anyway. So I'm already doing that for the damage bonus. So to then also have a defensive bonus, it's not nothing. I don't hate it. I don't think it's good enough, frankly. Like, that's not going to replace anything else in this tree, most likely. But definitely be aware of that, especially if you're on a higher difficulty level. I think Protective Coating could be quite good. Quite good. So keep that on your radar. I'm also going to call out Hunter Instinct. When adrenaline points are max, critical hit damage is increased. Especially for how focused my build is around combat and critical hits. Some more damage doesn't seem terrible. Probably too situational though, right? You have to max that adrenaline, which isn't trivial. And I did mention earlier that usually the encounter is over before I max adrenaline. So this probably isn't good enough. But similar to Protective Coating, I just wanted to call that out. I feel like that's situationally very good. The final one that I think I have to mention before I get out of the Alchemy branch here is Killing Spree. As much as I like critical hits, this seems interesting, but probably not good enough. Each opponent killed increases critical hit chance by 10% for the fight. That sounds awful fun. That sounds awful fun to me, but probably not good enough. I mean, obviously you have to invest 28 points into Alchemy just to get here, and then 5 more. So that's a super deep investment, and probably too situational, right? Like, a lot of these Witcher contracts are just a single enemy. It's like, hey, go kill the fiend, or go kill the tree thing. If there's no ads, right? And sometimes there are wolves and things, so sometimes it can be relevant, but I feel like a lot of the time it's just one-on-one, which would mean this gives you 0 value, which feels bad. But similar to these other ones that I called out, I think that's an interesting one to keep in mind. And once you have like more points than you know what to do with, maybe that's when you level up to and just kind of keep it in your back pocket and then swap it in situationally when you know you're going to be fighting a big group. And if we're talking critical hits, I have to call out Battle Frenzy over in the general branch here. Battle Frenzy changes the effect of Battle Trance such that every adrenaline point is now a plus 8% critical hit chance. And I love me some critical hits, so this seems super tempting, especially combined with Razor Focus. It basically increases my floor on critical hit chance to 38%, which really seems fun. However, I don't think it's quite good enough. Even if we give it a really generous assessment, even if we say, average adrenaline points, you're maybe looking at 2. So this would be plus 16. That'd bring your crit chance to 46%. What you're sacrificing is your damage, right? Each adrenaline point for battle trance increases weapon damage by 10%. So you're basically saying, okay, you can have 16% more crit chance or 20% more base damage, right? Because this bonus, this damage buff, affects everything, crits and non-crits. So I think I'd rather have the damage, like the guaranteed damage. I'd rather increase the floor on my damage than try to play for more crits. Now, that's obviously something that you could math craft and plug in some numbers and find sort of what the break even would be. And that would be a pretty interesting exercise, I think. But just passing the sniff test, and maybe my sniffer is defective, this doesn't seem good enough. Like, if I'm going to give up a 20%, again, assuming 2 adrenaline points, if I'm going to give up 20% of my damage, I feel like I want more upside than an additional 16% crit. And it's actually even more than losing the 10% damage per adrenaline point, because you have to slot it in over here, right? So for my layout, that decreases my attack power bonus from this mutagen. And this is even just a +5, but if I had a greater mutagen that I could put over here, right, you're losing a lot of damage here. So I don't think it's worth it ultimately. I don't think that math makes sense. I could be convinced otherwise. I would love to be convinced otherwise, because this does seem pretty fun. But I have a hard time seeing how you come out ahead here. So I think that's just about everything that I have to say about the main game skill tree here. Again, we're putting a lot of points into just bread and butter passive combat abilities, including resolve, so that we don't lose our adrenaline. We can protect that damage bonus. Or if you do like the swapping in for crit chance, same philosophy there, right? You want to protect the loss of that critical chance bonus, and you definitely want to have that free adrenaline point. I feel like those are no-brainers. I feel like this left-hand column here is pretty much locked in. The delusion, like I said, that's sort of the RP-oriented ability. Euro mileage may vary there. I do think Quen is just way too good. I think that's the bread and butter for a combat-oriented build. That's the sign I always have on tap. So definitely would recommend Exploding Shield, Active Shield. And if you're gonna have 2 sign abilities in here, I kind of feel like, why not a third, right? And then you can get that big bonus on your mutagen. And if you don't like Delusion, I would perhaps consider Quen Intensity. But the problem there, obviously, is you would need to get more points into here, into the signs branch, before you can get down to this. But that would maybe be sort of a stretch goal, right? I have my delusion in here, but I can very easily see going into combat situations, swapping that out for like a Quen Intensity. I think that'd be a pretty strong strategy. And then, cat school techniques, just love the light armor, which I should talk a little more about that actually, because if you compare the bear school and the cat school, right, or any of the schools, frankly, the cat school armor has the attack power bonus, right? 15% on the chest piece here, 8% there, 8% there. And these aren't even Grandmaster. This is just Masterwork, I believe. So it's just so much damage bonus that I don't think you can pass on that, compared to the bear school armor, which is more focused on vitality, more focused on defense. And for all the reasons I've mentioned already, I just feel like offense trumps defense so readily in this game, especially with active shield, right? But again, maybe I would eat these words on the highest difficulty setting. That's entirely possible. But yeah, again, this is focused on regular difficulty, main game. Take that for what it's worth. And then the last two here that I had plugged in were Rend and Sunder Armor. Rend certainly is just sort of my guilty pleasure of sorts. I can very easily see someone skipping this. And Sunder Armor too, as I've mentioned, time and again, I'm really hesitant on the value here. So this would definitely be on the bubble for me if I'm going to swap something out. I think getting to synergy into this spot and then possibly experimenting with Battle Frenzy in the final slot here could be interesting. That might be something that I entertain and try to crunch those numbers to see if that crit chance is worth it. But either way, if there's something that you want to play around with, I feel like these are the two spots that would be subject to changes. That concludes my thoughts on the main game skill tree for a combat-focused build, normal difficulty. I hope that helps folks navigate the tree and avoid some pitfalls and find some value. I'm probably going to have a follow-up to this episode when I get into the skill tree changes in the DLC, but we're going to get back into the story first. So that's what's on tap for next episode. Until then, thank you all so much. Please like and subscribe. This has been Honestman, and I'll see you next time with more Witcher 3.